Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Dr. Tasha Ebanks Garcia, and I'm the representative of the Cayman Islands government here in the UK. I was delighted to have attended the opening ceremony of London Climate Action Week earlier this week at the Aviva headquarters, and for my office to be hosting this special event during London Climate Action Week together with the Cayman Islands Department of Environment and the National Trust for the Cayman Islands, putting the spotlight on and celebrating the role migratory birds play in the global ecosystem. Did you know that around half of the UK bird species migrate each year, some taking short journeys and others traveling thousands of miles across to Africa? And the same is happening over in Canada and North America as they travel down towards the Caribbean and the Cayman Islands. And while birdsong is a natural wonder, with the dawn chorus signaling the start of the day, birds are also the sentinels of any changes to their environment, signaling alterations in the biological condition of ecosystems, including those resulting from a changing climate. In this session, we will explore the importance of birds in ecological processes from which we all benefit, nutrient cycles, carbon sequestration, and seed dispersal. And we're also thrilled to share news about the Motus posts, which will be installed in the Cayman Islands and which will enable better understanding of these flight paths and support conservation efforts. We have a fantastic live panel discussion for you coming up, but to start, I would like to open by inviting Sasha Dench, co-founder of the charity Conservation Without Borders and ambassador for the UN's Convention on Migratory Species, to share a keynote address. Welcome,
Fantastic.
Sasha.
Thank you, fantastic. And thank you very much for asking me to join you to say a few words. I'm really excited that you've chosen the theme of migratory birds, because the connections between migratory birds and climate change run very deep. Migratory birds are some of the most affected by climate change, and I know you have many experts on the panel today. So what I thought I would try and share with you is an angle on migratory birds and climate change, which is perhaps unique to me. And to tell the story of how migratory birds really opened my eyes to the harsh realities of climate change on an expedition that landed me the nickname of the human swan. And just so you know, as my background, I am a scientist. I've spoken about climate change for many years from a point of view of science and rational, rational thinking. But I think it's very different to sort of see and feel it for yourself. So anyway, in 2016, I flew the migration route of the Buick Swan from the Russian Arctic across 11 countries to the UK. In that, I was trying to help scientists to figure out why we were losing so many of the birds on migration. We've been looking at all the different threats to the birds, but they were dropping in numbers faster than tallied up with all the threats that we knew of. So what is it that we were missing? It was a journey of 7,000 kilometers on my back, an aircraft that clearly wasn't designed for international travel. However, it allowed me an insight into the world of birds that was pretty unique. First of all, I got to see the landscapes and the wetlands they rely on from their point of view. From above, also, you can really see the big picture, which is also really useful. And finally, with the paramotor, what you can do is take off and land on your feet, which meant that I could stop and speak to people anywhere along that route. And we're talking the Russian Arctic, the tundra, but the really interesting thing for me was seeing the impacts of climate change for myself, particularly the way that the speed of the change in the climate now, not just climate change in itself, the speed was such a challenge for migratory birds. For example, up in the Arctic, the mixture of plants that are up there, the number of trees that are migrating north, the species mix is changing so rapidly that it affects the lives of the swans. The best time for the swans to leave is now changing as well. They usually use a combination of daylight hours, but also warmth, but that is changing quite rapidly. ideal time to leave on migration. And the temperatures are quite different, but also the storms along the way are getting stronger and more frequent, which makes the flying conditions more and more challenging and gives them less windows when they can actually fly. And when you think about it, when they first leave on migration, they have young which are only about 12 weeks old, so they're not potentially the strongest flyers. So this is really important for them. The other things are maybe less obvious. On migration, as the birds reach a new wetland, the swans are now having to do more and more recce flights to try and see where there's food they can eat. Since about the 1970s, there haven't been enough wetlands for the birds to rely only on wetland plants. So each time they go to a new site, they're having to find waste crops. But as we change what we're growing in terms of agriculture in each site year on year, the birds are also having to work around that. So they're burning a lot more energy. Even our rapid movements towards renewables, I would never have guessed that necessarily, but in Europe, it means vast numbers of wind turbines in Eastern Europe. But to get that power to the Baltic and beyond, that's power lines that are being built directly across their migration routes. So more birds are dying from hitting power lines. So these things we would never necessarily have thought of before. The other really interesting thing was that the paramotor journey allowed me to speak to lots of people up in the Arctic. And the one time I had a load of Nanette's people rolling around laughing was when I said to them, what would you say to people who are cynical about climate change? And they said to me, oh, you're supposed to be the educated people of the West. How can you not see this? Because for them, climate change means the pits that they bury their food in normally, the tundra isn't freezing as much. So those pits are no longer frozen, their food gets rotten way more easily. So they're often eating quite rotten raw reindeer meat that we wouldn't normally eat, for example. It means the thawing means that the tourists that are going on the tundra in their quad bikes are tearing up the tundra because it's not frozen anymore. And that's important for reindeer, obviously. It also means the thawing of diseases like anthrax that have been trapped in the Arctic for a long time. And that has caused, whole villages to evacuate and kill people. So for them, it is incredibly real, climate change. And so I guess this was the first time that I was really seeing and feeling it very much from the point of view of the birds. Unfortunately, I guess after that expedition, it made me still kind of want to follow migratory birds, but definitely made climate change a key part of the story. And yeah, unfortunately, in 2019, we also lost our family home in the Australian bushfires, which were bushfires. We'd fought many bushfires before, but these were on a scale that were vastly different. We had fires which were 11 kilometers high because they were joining with the thunder clouds, and they moved much faster than any before. So we pumped 120,000 litres of water into tanks, ready to fight the fires as we normally did with hoses, and then had to look at the updates on Facebook and go, no, we're out of here, we can't. There's no way that us with little hoses are going to fight this. So again, I had another opportunity to really feel what climate change means, but also how you can end up in a bit of a snowball effect. So after those fires, obviously there was many months where there was absolutely no wildlife, not even insects, and that was pretty shocking out there. But then the next time we had heavy rains, and we're quite used to extreme weather in Australia, but the next time you had heavy rains, because most of the big old trees had died, it led to massive downpours, floods, but also mudslides. So it also washed away all the bridges in our area as well. So you can see how climate change, once it gets going, can really snowball. And I guess all of that made the issue very real. And yet with all of it, I remain really optimistic. I still think that we, as humans, are incredibly smart. We've changed the world so quickly since the Industrial Revolution. We can do it even faster now if we all put our mind to it. And I personally have found, that seeing the world through the eyes of migratory birds is a really important way of doing it. It gives you tangible examples, but it also forces you to look at the world from above, a bit of the overview effect. And once we start to look at the planet as a whole, but also as a finite body, then I think, well, we really can start to make sensible decisions about what to do with it in future. So with that, thank you very much. And I wish you all the best with your session.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us. What an absolute privilege to have you join us this afternoon. Thank you. So as many of you know, the Cayman Islands are part of the United Kingdom Overseas Territories, which together are home to 94% of British endemic species and 90% of the biodiversity for which the UK government has responsibility. And while the Cayman Islands is well known internationally as a leading international financial center, many may not know of our history of practicing responsible management and sustainable use of our natural environment and natural resources through environmental protection, conservation, wise use, scientific research, and public education. On Grand Cayman during World Migratory Day, Sangeeta Laudas, Senior Advisor to the Cayman Islands Government Office UK, met up with Patricia Bradley, a renowned ornithologist who has lived in the Cayman Islands since the 1980s. I hope you enjoy this unscripted and absolutely authentic conversation.
Patricia, thank you so much for meeting with me today, and super special since it's World Migratory Bird Day, as I understand it. Perfect. Well, as I said, it's really special to meet you today and just to learn a little bit more about you and also just understand the importance of migration. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. And I have your book here, which is one of the beautiful books that you've written and worked on. I understand you arrived here in the 80s, is that correct?
Yes, came here in 80. And I'd been in the West Indies for time before that, so I was familiar with birds. So I started working, when I came there was lots of wild spaces left, especially on the two of the sister islands. And also there was no written paper. There were 4 or 5 papers on Cayman birds. So I started finding out what was here and where they were. And then I published the first field guide in the 80s, and then I worked on a checklist for the British Museum, and it went on and on. And I'm involved in the Caribbean as well, in the Caribbean Society of Seabirds.
Well, it's an amazing career and amazing legacy. And I think one of the reasons I really wanted to sort of meet with you is I think the importance of birds migrating is sometimes a little bit undervalued. It's not something that we really think about. Why? Perhaps you can explain why should we value the fact that birds are migrating, and what does that actually mean? I mean, I understand it as moving from where there's low resources to high resources, but why do birds do that?
Well, they do it for successful breeding, but it's a historical thing, presumably from the Ice Age, and the importance now is preserving. The majority go from North America to South America, and some of them stop in the Caribbean. And so the islands of the Caribbean have become very important as stopover sites where the birds can refuel. And some stay longer, some will actually stay all winters or 3 or 4 months and then go on. But if you take away these feeding grounds, if they've flown up from South America and they've nowhere to stop, if they've got no wetlands, no forests, no fresh water, that's when crisis happens. But now there's a realization that we're running out of space and we're running out of time, added to climate change, added with climate change on it. So we need to look after what we've got, and people are beginning to. The National Trust is working hard on that. The government is, through the National Conservation Society, is preserving ecologically sensitive habitats. So the idea is to build blocks of habitat as opposed to small areas. You buy as big as you can, and you try to relate them to other areas, so the sea and the coast as well.
And so obviously that's why it's super important to to preserve a lot of the natural habitats, because that loss will then result in loss of this sort of stopover habitat for these birds. With Cayman Islands, where it's located so important?
It's important because we're on mainly the central flyway down the Mississippi, and then we get birds from the Florida, the East Coast flyway. We are seeing declines in species. Some species no longer come that were common in the 80s, and some are very reduced in numbers.
And I think just thinking about sort of the global ecosystem, again, you know, many people wouldn't really think about the sort of the value or the impact that, so in relation to sort of birds coming from north to south and going, is there like a seed dispersal? Is there, I mean, what are the kind of general, if
in a migration chain, you want to make everybody responsible on the way up, so that each stopover site becomes important, so that you just don't say those are South American birds or those are North American birds. They're actually everybody's birds. They're totally United Nations. They don't have countries. Effectively, they breed in one place, winter in another, but we all share them.
so they're true global citizens?
They're global citizens, and we need to treat them as such.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just been such a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for just sharing some of your insights on this very, very special day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay! That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed Sasha's opening remarks and also the interview with Patricia Bradley that included some breathtaking footage of the Cayman Islands. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our esteemed lineup of speakers joining us today from both the UK and the Cayman Islands. I'm delighted that we have Ian Redmond OBE with us. Ian is a wildlife biologist and conservationist and an ambassador for the Convention on Migratory Species. Next up, we have Simone Williams, a research officer with the Terrestrial Resources Unit for the Cayman Islands Department of Environment. And last but not least, we have Catherine Childs, who has worked for the National Trust for the Cayman Islands since 2013, where she currently serves as the Environmental Programs Manager. So starting with Ian. Ian, can you tell us a little bit about your role together with Sasha as an ambassador for the UN's Convention on Migratory Species and the importance of migration across the globe generally?
Thank you, Tasha. Yes, I think the fact that the UN has a convention for the conservation of migratory species is wonderful. And we have about 140 countries that are parties to that convention. Not all countries have signed it yet. And certainly in North America, we've got some big gaps. But there are other treaties between countries in North America and South America to help protect migratory species, which, as you just heard from that conversation with Patricia and Sangeeta, birds know no borders, and it's no good having first-class conservation in one country if the neighboring country, or perhaps on the other side of the planet, they have a very different outlook, and the birds are killed there for what seemed to the local people to be perfectly valid and reasonable reasons, but are impacting on this whole thing. But let's just broaden out a little bit, because we're at a time where we're facing, at best estimate, 1 million species becoming extinct within our lifetime. This is a scary prospect. And it's scary not just because naturalists like them. There's one take-home message I want to come out of this introductory talk, is that these species, yes, birds are beautiful. And when you see them up close, they're just wonderful because of the plumage, the colors, the form, but they're not ornaments. And sometimes I think we're so carried away by their beauty and how inspiring they are to us creative humans that we forget that they're actually really important components of the ecosystems on which we all depend. So protecting birds, whether they're migratory or resident, is important, not just because they're nice and we like to go out with our binoculars on a weekend and watch them, but because they're doing something. Every day they're working on behalf of the whole biosphere, the thin bit of livable planet in which we live. And let me just read a section from a book that you can't yet have read because it hasn't been published. I'm just reviewing Wildlife in the Balance by Simon Musto. And just a couple of days ago, I read this passage and thought, I have to read this to you. What Simon wrote is, long-term studies using weather radars reveal that 2.5 billion North American migratory songbirds have disappeared since 1970, a decline of 30%.
Wow.
That's a huge number of birds, and whether they're large waterfowl or small passerines, the biomass of 1 billion or 2.5 billion birds is huge. And what birds do is to help nutrients cycle in ecosystems. They eat stuff and poop stuff, and their droppings fertilize the soil, and what they eat can sometimes affect agriculture. Because if you have a flock of several thousand small birds coming and feeding on insects in your field, those insects are not eating your crops. And if those birds decline by 30%, that's 30% more insects that are going to be eating your crops. And you get to the point where some insects actually reach plague proportions. So losing that number of birds matters, not just because they're beautiful and it'll be a shame if you don't have them for our children to see. So he goes on, Simon Musto, that twice every year, up to 2.9 billion songbirds migrate between Europe and Africa, with an overall decline of 50% in the last half century. So again, we're seeing these massive declines. Now, next week, the members of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, nice snappy title that these UN bodies come up with, IPBES are meeting to discuss connectivity. It's the key to migratory birds and migratory mammals. Whether you're talking about marine species, the Cayman Islands is important for turtles. They come and nest on your beaches, and then they disappear and go thousands of miles around the Caribbean and to who knows where. We're beginning to find out by putting little tags on their back and plotting their movements. And there's a nice map on your government website, which I was pleased to see, because we're doing the same with migratory birds from Europe. And now we know, because of the individual birds, that they not only go down to West Africa, but down to the Congo Basin. Now, I've spent much of my life studying gorillas and elephants. And the fact that when somebody writes to the Times saying they've heard the first cuckoo of the year, which tends to happen in the UK, people are very proud of hearing the first cuckoo. What they haven't really thought about is that for that cuckoo to get to the UK, it fed up on insects in forests where the larval stages of those insects probably fed on plants that were seed dispersed by gorillas and elephants. And the weather patterns that build up over the Congo Basin move westwards over the Atlantic to Amazonia. And then the huge weather patterns that sweep north from Amazonia across the Cayman Islands and to North America, and then carry water across to Britain and Europe, those weather systems build up because of the evapotranspiration of trees in the Congo Basin forest that would have been the result of an ecological event perhaps 600, 700, 800 years ago, when an elephant or a gorilla ate a fruit and pooped a seed. So it's all about seed dispersal and connectivity, and connectivity physically, but also in our minds. So there's one thing that migratory birds do, is to help us connect to the bird we're looking out the window. I'm in a cottage in Wales at the moment. Under the eaves here are swallows nesting. They're feeding their chicks every day, coming back and forth every couple of minutes. And I know that those swallows at the end of the season are going to fly south to Africa, and they'll be feeding on insects that are in the ecosystems that the big African charismatic animals are found in. So this connectivity, they'll be discussing it at IPBES, and the IPBES is supposed to be for biodiversity what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is for the Climate Convention. It's supposed to advise policy. And what is very clear is that we've been getting policy wrong, because we're seeing this biodiversity decline. And because of this horrible word biodiversity and the fact that most people don't fully understand what it encapsulates, it's nature. And we depend on nature. So I hope the IPBES discussions on connectivity lead to better policies, and that the UK, through its overseas territories, including the Cayman Islands, can influence this downward trajectory, bottom it out, and have biodiversity recover. Because without that recovery, we are not going to win the fight against climate change, and we're not going to have a habitable planet. I don't want to alarm you, but we're up against it, and we need to change our thinking. So thank you for organizing this event, and I look forward to hearing my other panelists' thoughts on this.
Oh, well, thank you, Ian. That was interesting. And And it was a little bit alarming, but I think a little alarming is not a bad thing. I think we all need to stop and reflect on our role, our responsibility, and just kind of appreciating the bigger ecosystem that we live in, that we belong to, that we contribute to, and that we're responsible for. So I just want to turn to Simone Williams now to tell us a little bit about your background, Simone, and talk about the species of birds that come to the Cayman Islands, as well as the work being done by the Department of Environment in relation to understanding and supporting the migration process.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a research officer with the Terrestrial Resource Unit with the Department of Environment, where we monitor, manage, and protect Cayman's native flora and fauna. This is actually my first year in this capacity. But previously, I was completing my Master's of Science degree at Trent University, and I worked at the Toronto Zoo as a research assistant. For my thesis, I was looking at the survival rates and habitat usage of migratory shorebirds and passerines, which are songbirds. My study focused on their life cycle, which was divided up into phases. So we can look at it as the breeding phase, migratory phase, and the overwintering phase. So I traveled to various breeding sites in the near Arctic, where I surveyed birds by looking at the number of birds, their reproductive success, and their body condition when they arrived on the wintering grounds. Likewise, we surveyed the wintering grounds, so the Cayman Islands and other Caribbean islands, assessing their abundance, diversity, and how various habitats were being used by these birds. So we used marked and recapture methods to determine what shorebirds were experiencing the greatest mortality. And we found that during their migratory and overwintering phase, they were experiencing the greatest mortality rates. And songbirds were actually experiencing the greatest mortality during migration. There are several factors that play into this, such as alteration of habitat, pollution, hunting, and of course, climate change. The populations of migratory birds have seen declines since the 1990s in North America. And it's because these birds rely on very restricted sets of habitat, and they cross pretty much hemispheres, thousands of miles. So I believe Prisma said it best when he said that birds are the sentinels of the planet's health. Since their life cycle, it spans thousands of miles, their diversity, abundance, the distribution, and population demographics, and the health are indicators of the health of the ecosystems that they depend on. So migratory birds really, they show high site fidelity, and this is for good reason, because evolutionarily, they've evolved with stable rhythms, the emergence of insects and invertebrate life and fish, and patterns of seasonal change and predictable weather. Well, this is actually now changing. They still have the instinct to travel northwards, because this used to lead to success in rearing young. And so birds will actually fly northwards during the springtime thaw, because it reveals, plentiful nesting areas. There's less competition for space. And there's the warmth triggers the emergence of insects and invertebrate life, which is a bounty of life that they can feed on. I remember when I was working in Churchill in the Arctic, thinking that I would need a snowsuit. And in actuality, I was wearing a bug suit because of the immense insect life and the barrage of buzzing in my ears from mosquitoes and flies. And I remember seeing birds on the nest, just snapping up at every little creepy crawler that passed their way, and they would just be incubating their eggs. They didn't have to move very far to feed their young. But there's other reasons as well. Like, we did an artificial nest experiment, and we saw that egg predation is another reason why these birds would fly north. By putting out these artificial nests at different latitudes, we saw that the more north you went, the less eggs were getting eaten. And this makes sense, because the more north you go, there's bigger mammals and animals that are not necessarily looking at eggs as their main source of food. They're more looking for caribou or hare, or hares and lemmings. So birds migrate north for, for safety of their young, food abundance, and the space to raise their young. But our recent observations of their body condition on the breeding grounds has been very concerning, because they're arriving very emaciated, and as a result, they die from the stress. They're not able to weather the initial springtime thaw. And so this means that on the wintering grounds or during their migration, they're not able to gain enough fat to become the butterballs that they need to be to survive their migration. And, birds need to stop at key stopover sites where they can find food, water, and a place to find refuge and rest. And thankfully, like the Cayman Islands, well, it's situated on one of the major flyways, the Atlantic flyways. And this island has a variety of habitats and very important bird areas. Like we have the dry tropical forests and mangroves where passerines like the black-throated blue warbler, northern parula, common yellowthroat, northern water thrush, and yellow-bellied sapsuckers will come year after year to the same tree stands and find food and get fat for their next leg of their journey. We have our beautiful coastlines, our shrublands, which have mud flats intertwined between them, and our inland ponds for fresh water. And these birds there's birds that stop here, like shorebirds and water birds like the semi-palmated plover, white American pelicans, sanderlings, ruddy turnstones, white rump sandpipers, and least sandpipers. And, they come here year after year because these islands are really an oasis for them on their journey, on their migration journey. And some of them even overwinter. Like we do have a lot of juvenile ruddy turnstones that actually stay here all winter round before they are able to fly north to breed. So the islands serve as a very important area. Now, and the Department of Environment really works hard with conjunction with many entities like the National Trust, the Botanic Park, other universities, environmental clubs and organizations like the Mangrove Rangers and Birds Caribbean, and businesses and individuals. And we work with them so that we can recognize, and they like to nominate areas to preserve for the future. So we can preserve Cayman's unique biodiversity. And, it's really by working with people that we see their connection and their passion and their love for nature. And if we really want conservation to work, we really need people to fall in love with nature, because ultimately we do protect what we love. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that idea of falling in love with nature. And I think certainly having the opportunity to work with all of you as we put together this webinar, I certainly have a much greater appreciation, and sitting right now in the city of London and listening, I can hear the birds in London, and it's just, I have a newfound appreciation for birdsong and for nature. And I just want to thank you all in working with us to put together this webinar, and to certainly open my eyes up, and hopefully those that have joined us in this webinar, that you're opening up their eyes as well. I also love the idea, as you shared, that some birds visit the same palm trees, so they go back to the same places, and it really, I think, highlights the importance of preservation of our trees and natural assets which are home to these visitors, including our mangroves, which is work that has increasingly been important for the National Trust for the Cayman Islands, and which our next speaker, Catherine Childs, will tell us about, as well as sharing with us the news about the exciting installation of the Motus post on all 3 of our islands later this year.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on this panel. It's great to be included amongst these fabulous speakers this morning. And I guess I want to start out by speaking to people who might be in the Northern Hemisphere this morning and are used to the birds around you, like you are, Tasha, hearing the bird songs outside, but you might not think about what happens when those birds go on their migratory journey and how vulnerable they can be on those journeys. And in the Caribbean, it's actually a global biodiversity conservation hotspot. It's home to over 700 species of birds. Roughly half of these bird species are residents in the Caribbean, including 171 that are endemic, meaning they're found nowhere else in the entire world, but here. The other half are migratory. So they split their time between temperate and tropical habitats in the Americas and are shared among multiple countries along the way. For some migratory birds, the Caribbean islands are a perfect winter retreat. I'm sure a lot of our human visitors feel the same way. They arrive in early fall and stay until the spring. Others use one or more of the islands as stopover sites, places to rest and refuel as they fly on their journeys. Whether they stay or move on, though, they are much loved visitors and they reflect the seasons and they have a big part of our cultural expressions. The National Trust works to preserve everything that's special about Cayman, including its historic heritage. And a lot of what makes us unique and what's part of our cultural heritage here is nature. So it's important for the protection of Cayman's cultural heritage as well as its natural heritage to preserve these places. Unfortunately, around the world, bird populations are declining, as we've heard all morning. So 59 Caribbean species are at risk of extinction. They're listed as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered by the IUCN. A recent study found that nearly 30% of the bird populations in North America since 1970 are gone already or are on their way out. And Caribbean species are among those that are in trouble. So birds in the Caribbean face an entire suite of threats, including habitat loss and fragmentation, pollution, invasive species, and climate change is only aggravating and making all of those threats worse. And that's a problem for wildlife, as we're talking about this morning, but also for people, obviously. So we're experiencing increasingly intense hurricanes, longer droughts, and dramatic changes in our marine environment as well. And these threats are only growing for these vulnerable birds, and we can't afford to lose any more of these populations. So research on our birds has progressed considerably in recent decades, but we still lack basic information on some of the species, and we need to understand them better if we are going to be able to protect them. But the conservation of migratory birds is complex. We have to know about their movements between distinct regions spanning hundreds of thousands of kilometers that collectively support breeding, wintering, and stopover habitats. Climate and land use change are the major factors that's causing the declines globally. And then what we do locally will have an effect on how these birds are able to survive this stressful journey that they make every year. These risks are compounded by cross-seasonal effects where environmental conditions are experienced in one location, either their breeding grounds, wintering grounds, or stopover areas, affect their fitness in subsequent locations, as Simone referred to. They're not getting to their breeding grounds in the condition they need to be in to survive the stresses they experience there. So we know that we have to act now to preserve these important habitats that are important for people, as well as these disappearing animals and all life on Earth. But how do we most effectively do that? There's a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it. And so that's where these Motus wildlife tracking system receivers come in. So the National Trust here in the Cayman Islands, we applied for a grant to get these Motus devices here in the Cayman Islands, to put one on each of our islands so we can find out exactly what species are coming here, when they're arriving, how many are coming, and most importantly, what habitats are they utilizing when they come here so we can make sure that we protect those areas. Basically, it's a collaborative research network that's international. It uses coordinated automated radio telemetry to facilitate research and education on the ecology and conservation of migratory animals. Named after the Latin word for movement, Motus uses automated radio telemetry arrays to study the movements and behavior of flying animals. They use little tiny nano tags that go on the back of the bird, and they're so tiny and light that they even use them on bats and even insects to track movements. These tiny transmitters weigh as little as 0.2 grams. The system harnesses the collective resources of many independent researchers in a much larger collaborative effort. There are now more than 1,200 Motus stations located on 4 continents across 31 countries. But it was all through North America, and then there's a lot in Central and South America, but the region throughout the Caribbean was dark. We didn't have any receivers to pick up what was happening when these birds were passing through, or stopping for their for the summer or the winter here to refuel and to get the food and the water that they so desperately need. Now, the Cayman Islands is going to be one of the first here in the Caribbean region to put up these transmitters and these receivers so that we can know exactly what is happening here. So these receiver stations have thousands, there's thousands, by the way, of these deployed nanotags on birds. More than 236 species have been documented, mostly birds. And so data from this network has already expanded our understanding of bird movements, including pinpointing migration routes and key stopover sites, as well as these birds' movements, their habitat use, and their behavior during breeding and non-breeding seasons. And it's also important to state that Birds Caribbean and Caribbean birds have worked together to bring these stations into the Caribbean. And there's a host of educational resources that are associated with this as well. So here in Cayman, we have been looking at places to put them on each of our islands. And we're really putting emphasis on trying to put them on areas that are community access sites. So community centers, close to schools, so that we can invite the public to come in and to see what's happening, how we are tracking these birds, how we are seeing exactly who's coming and where they're going, so that we can build a sense of ownership with these young children and build education about what's happening, so that they grow up understanding how important nature is in their lives and why it's important to preserve it. So, as we've stated already this morning, birds play a critical role in our ecosystems as far as pollinating plants, spreading seeds, helping to control insects, but they're also valuable indicators of change. Many populations have been seriously declining for decades, and a third of North American bird species need urgent conservation action to avoid extinction. We need to act now to protect habitats and systems that support all life on Earth. And it's important to remember that these ecosystems that support these species of birds and other wildlife also support us. They have these ecosystem services that we rely upon, that we tend to forget that we're part of nature as well. And by protecting these habitats, for example, here in Cayman, we have the largest mangrove ecosystem in all of the Caribbean, intact mangrove ecosystem. And Grand Cayman's a little bitty island, so you'd be surprised that this is the place where you're going to find the largest intact mangrove ecosystem in the Caribbean. Really important for wildlife, but that's going to help the community here in Cayman be more resilient to the effects of climate change. It will protect us from these stronger storms that we're experiencing. It actually creates land underneath it. And right now it's keeping up with the pace of climate change. So what a neat trick to have an ecosystem that's building land at the same rate as sea level rise is occurring. It creates its own precipitation patterns. So it can keep rainfall going even in longer droughts that we're expected to experience. And of course, those droughts will be punctuated by these huge rainfall events, and wetlands, of course, absorb the excess rain associated with those. So for the communities of people that are here, we need to protect these ecosystems as well as for the wildlife, because people rely on nature. We must protect nature for the human communities as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine. This is absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you all for sharing these insights and updates. And I see that we do have some questions from our online audience. We're going to try to answer all the questions posed, but if we don't get your questions today, we will make sure they are addressed in the event summary circulated afterwards. We invite you to share your questions in the Q&A box. So the first question, I think we'll direct at Ian. So a question came in, one of our participants are concerned about birds and wind turbines and the challenges of renewable energy and nature interacting. Any thoughts around that?
I have many thoughts, but far more knowledgeable thoughts have been compiled into documents for the Convention on Migratory Species. And I put in the chat box a link to the CMS report on wind turbines, not just wind turbines, but as Sasha mentioned, actually the power lines that go across migratory routes can cause mortality, particularly for the larger swans and other larger migratory birds. I would say that you can greatly reduce the mortality by siting a wind turbine where it isn't likely to meet large numbers of migratory birds. So don't build them in a flyway. It seems kind of obvious, but not everyone is thinking about birds when they're thinking about how much wind there is. But that's the other thing. wind turbines, if you set them so that they start to turn at a slightly higher wind speed, it's less likely birds will be flying. So birds don't like to fly in high wind speeds. Wind turbines do very well. And what I've read is that it reduces the power generated by a very small percentage, but it reduces the mortality by a huge percentage just by adjusting it with birds in mind. And again, people who look after wind turbines aren't necessarily thinking of that aspect of it. So we need to make them aware that you can reduce the mortality. It's not just birds, migratory bats and insects too, large insects smashed by rotating blades. But I'd also say that rotating blades are not the only kind of wind turbine. Vertical axis wind turbines don't have that effect. And so why don't we use more, and that you can get some very large and very beautifully shaped curved wind turbines that don't have the mortality, but do generate power from the wind. So I think we just need to stop sticking up propeller type ones and turning them to get maximum power and consider the environmental impact. But I'm glad that that question was asked.
Yes, thank you. Kathy, yes.
I was just going to say that it's important to remember that climate change will take out many, many, many more times the number of birds that wind generators do. So yes, we need to site them in the right places. We need to use bladeless ones whenever possible. We need to do everything we can to reduce the mortality, but we shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater in this circumstance. We do need to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And Simone, this question for you. So 30 by 30 is a worldwide initiative for governments to designate 30% of the Earth's land and ocean area as protected areas by 2030. Can you share a little bit about what the Department of Environment has done to contribute to achieving this goal, and any plans for work that's going to be taken forward over the next few years as the Cayman Islands contributes to this 30 by 30 initiative?
So yes, that is our goal is 30% protected on the Cayman Islands. We just had our next round of nominations, so we're actually in the midst of vetting them and organizing which areas we're going to protect next. So it's in the process. We are trying to reach our goal of 30%. We do have, I guess, a little bit more protected lands on Grand than compared to the sister islands. So we are really going to be looking at, trying to balance out where protections are on each of the islands. So we do capture key areas. And we also are trying to connect our existing protected areas. So we can have these corridors of protected areas across different types of habitats. So there's a lot going on, and hopefully we will make our goals soon because development is very fast here.
Then thank you, Simone. And for Kathy, what sort of effect do you think the extension of the east-west arterial will have on migration of the diversity and population of birds in Cayman?
That's a great question, and one that's difficult to answer right now because we don't really know how that road is projected to be built. If they do an elevated causeway so that the water can still flow back and forth and the mangroves are protected and they retain their ecosystem health, then it's possible that it will have little effect. We also need to look at what comes with roads. It's well known that if you put a road in, that's only the beginning, then that's all the development that goes along with that. So we are asking that the development to the north, which is where the central mangrove wetland is prohibited so that we can retain the health of that ecosystem and we don't lose it to development. So if those things can be honored, then it's possible that that road will have little effect on our the health of the ecosystems and bird populations as well. So we just we're working with the government to try to see if those ideas can come to fruition. Great question.
And what possibly may be, given our time, the last question, Kathy, there's a comment, great to see that the National Trust is moving forward with the Motus project so that we can learn more about bird populations in order to better protect them and their habitats. And the question is, what other initiatives is the National Trust for the Cayman Islands working on currently?
Oh, well, the National Trust works on many different things. We have a really important blue iguana conservation program that's been hugely successful. We have visiting scientists come here all the time to learn how to protect iguanas in regions where they come from. But as far as climate change is concerned, we also have, we protect mangroves very strongly in the National Trust because we understand that these ecosystems are like the rock stars for carbon sequestration and storage, as well as being great ecosystems for habitat for species, of course. So we've actually started a carbon offset program so that local businesses and corporations and people who are flying to other countries and want to offset their flights can do it with projects located here in the Cayman Islands that will protect our mangrove ecosystems through our land reserve fund at the National Trust. So we can purchase mangroves that would otherwise have been deforested and make sure that they're protected in perpetuity for the people of the Cayman Islands and the animals of the Cayman Islands and our visiting migratory species forever.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for your time and your invaluable expertise serving on the panel today. And I'd now like to share a special message recorded for us by Charlie Butt, the Caribbean Territories Program Manager for the UK charity Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, on the importance of our island's mangroves as habitats for birds, as well as the carbon capture services they perform, and quite possibly the topic of a future webinar. And then we'll play for you a beautiful video entitled Birds Life in the Cayman Islands, created by the National Trust for the Cayman Islands for schools and educational purposes.
So thank you very much to the panel for all your thought-provoking words, and thank you to the Cayman Islands government in the UK for the invitation to share a few thoughts and reflections on this topic. So my name is Charlie Butt and I manage the RSPB's Caribbean Conservation Programme. I'm absolutely delighted to join you as part of London Climate Action Week and to put a spotlight on the Caribbean region, which is one of 30 global biodiversity hotspots, home to most of the world's wildlife found nowhere else on Earth. The Caribbean is also under ever-increasing pressure from the climate crisis, with tropical storms and record-breaking hurricanes hitting the region with increasing intensity and frequency. The RSPB has been working in the UK overseas territories now for decades, as the UK overseas territories are home to more than 94% of the UK's unique biodiversity. The lens through which we work is saving the most threatened species, the most significant sites for nature, primarily important bird and biodiversity areas, key biodiversity areas, and supporting the advancement of good environmental governance, as well as strengthening the capacity of our partners. The Cayman Islands, a UK overseas territory, makes a substantial contribution to the UK's unique biodiversity. Species found nowhere else on Earth include the iconic blue iguana, the sister island's rock iguana, and the national bird of the Cayman Islands, the Cayman parrot. As well as iconic species, the Cayman Islands are also home to internationally significant sites, none more so than the Central Mangrove Wetland, which is the largest intact mangrove wetland ecosystem in the Caribbean region. At 3,553 hectares, the Central Mangrove Wetland offers a home to unique assemblages of species such as the West Indian whistling duck, snowy egrets, 4 species of heron, and migratory species, of course, such as the yellow warbler. As well as supporting significant stands of red, black and white mangrove, the site provides a protection from flooding and storms and provides fresh water to the west of Grand Cayman, and acts as a marine nursery which stock coral reefs. Cayman mangroves store over 8 million tonnes of carbon, which is about 30% of all the UK's of the carbon locked up in the Caribbean overseas territories, meaning that the Cayman Islands are truly a mangrove powerhouse when it comes to the fight against climate change. Given that only 25% of the Central Mangrove Wetland is protected, there is an immense opportunity for the Cayman Islands government to step up and secure the full protection of this vital resource for the Cayman and for the world. Birds are, of course, an important sentinel of change, as today's event has highlighted. Another important metric is the extent of quality intact habitat. So the RSPB welcomes the spotlight the Cayman Islands government has given to nature and migratory species in this event, and I hope that in my brief submission I've helped to underscore the importance of site as well as species protection, not just for nature, but in the fight against the climate crisis. Thank you very much for your time.
Wow, nature.
Nearly 260 species of birds have been recorded in the Cayman Islands.
50 are resident, meaning that they live here all year round.
Some are unique and endemic to the islands, like this Cayman parrot.
The rest are migratory, meaning that they're only visiting our islands.
The Cayman Islands is en route between North and South America and provides an important resting stop for birds making this journey between August and May every year. Other migratory birds visit our islands to stay for the winter before returning to their breeding sites on the mainland in spring.
All birds need a habitat to survive. A bird's habitat is a safe place that offers shelter to hide from predators, as well as providing food, water, and space to nest.
Different habitats are important to different species. Ducks, like whistling ducks and lesser scaup, and wading birds like snowy egrets and tricolor heron, live in ponds and mangrove forests. They eat small fish and insects that live in this habitat too.
White pelicans are rare but welcome migrants. Here we see them exploring a pond before they head out to sea.
Seabirds depend on a variety of habitats for nesting. Brown boobies fly far out to sea to catch fish and then return to their nests high on the cliffs of Cayman Brac.
These nests are where they lay their eggs and where they care for their young.
Something they've been doing along these cliffs for hundreds or thousands of years.
And these seabirds rely heavily on healthy oceans to survive.
Cayman's dry forest is home to land birds like Zenata doves, bananaquits, and our national bird, the Cayman parrot. Look at these holes in a coconut palm. They were made by a yellow-bellied sapsucker, a winter visitor that probably returns to this exact tree year after year. The holes fill with sap, which attracts insects.
What would happen if it disappeared?
The National Trust counts bird populations in Cayman every year. Birds are important bioindicators, which means that doing this can tell scientists if an ecosystem is healthy or needs protection, which in turn protects the other species that live here too. Many of these habitats are under threat in the Cayman Islands and around the world.
Trees are cut down and wetlands filled in to make way for buildings.
Plastic pollution washes ashore or is just carelessly dumped.
Tall buildings with lots of windows can confuse birds and cause collisions. An invasive species like cats kill birds visiting or resident.
But what can we do to help?
You can advocate, that means support, for the protection of important habitats. Keep your cats inside. Use pictures or decals to break up the reflection on windows and keep birds safe from collisions.
You could arrange a mangrove, beach, or roadside cleanup.
And keep lots of trees in your yard. The Cayman Islands is home to many different species of birds. Some migratory, some resident, and some found nowhere else in the world. They all rely on their habitats to survive. What other things can you think of to help birds in their habitats?
I want to thank you all for joining our online event today, and we hope we have shared useful knowledge and expertise and given you hope and inspiration to continue protecting the wonderful planet we live on and the creatures we share it with. And finally, please enjoy the rest of London Climate Action Week, and we look forward to connecting with you via email, in person, and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter.